Guthrie. It is Tuesday. This is actually Nancy's house. This is the closest I've been able to get to the back side of the house, and I'm going to take you really up close in a second. Some interesting things that you can't see from the drone that you can only really see from back here.
On day 65, Brian Entin stood at the back of Nancy Guthrie's property, not watching from a distance, not flying equipment overhead, on foot, in the desert brush, close enough to make out the 3 separate doors at the rear of her house with his own eyes. Standing next to him was a retired Pima County homicide detective, a man who spent decades working violent crime in this exact jurisdiction, and what that detective told him about something he had spotted weeks earlier in the early drone footage from this investigation had never been named publicly. Not in any article, not in any commentary, not in any analysis from any outlet that had been covering this case. Nobody said it. And what he saw raises a question about what investigators were actually doing at that property, a question that still has no public answer. Oh, family, stay with me, because today is day 70, and the thing said on camera 8 days ago, in a single broadcast that thousands of people watched, is something the public conversation has not caught up to yet. We're going to catch up to it right now. Family, before I walk you through what Kurt Dabbs saw in that early drone footage, what perspective shots are, and why a career homicide detective had never seen them used outside of a shooting or a violent assault, what they tell us about what investigators actually reconstructed in the first 2 weeks of this case, and what Brian Entin's sustained presence on the ground made possible that nobody else made possible. We need to stop. 70 days. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, taken from her Catalina Foothills home in Tucson, Arizona, in the early hours of February 1, 2026. 70 days since the doorbell camera went offline at 1:47 in the morning. 70 days since her pacemaker application disconnected at 2:28, placing the moment she left the reach of her phone in the dead of a desert night. 70 days since her family arrived to find immaculate rooms, a propped open back door, and blood on the front porch. No arrest, no named suspect, no publicly confirmed forensic breakthrough. Let's pray. Lord, for Nancy, 70 days. For the Guthrie family still waiting, for the investigators who stood in specific positions at that property in the first 2 weeks and photographed what they found, for the record they built, for the truth it contains, for the thing nobody named until day 59. Amen. Type Amen. Where are you watching from? Country and city. Type it now. Hit subscribe, because the details in this case surface quietly, and when they do, they change everything. Now let me show you what Kurt Dabbs saw. Before we get to the perspective shots, I need to acknowledge what has been consuming most of the analytical bandwidth in this case over the past week. The ransom notes. Multiple communications claiming to hold Nancy, or claiming knowledge of her whereabouts, have surfaced and circulated in the media and in the online community. Savannah Guthrie said publicly in her first interview that she believes some of the notes her family personally received and responded to were genuine. She was equally clear that many of the communications circulating are not real. I think most of them, it's my understanding, are not real. And the 2 notes that we received, I tend to believe those are real. The FBI has not publicly verified any specific communication as confirmed contact from whoever actually took Nancy. The standard for verification in these situations is specific and demanding proof of life details only the responsible party could know. A communication thread that holds across multiple exchanges without contradiction. None of that has been publicly confirmed as met by any note that has surfaced to date. That uncertainty, the hovering question of whether anyone is still communicating, whether Nancy is alive to be communicated about, whether the reward has simply attracted fabricators, has consumed most of the conversation around this case over the past week. I understand why. It is the most emotionally urgent open question. But while that conversation has been running, something that happened 8 days ago has been sitting largely unexamined in the public record. Something said on camera on day 59 by a man who spent his career working violent crimes in Pima County, this exact jurisdiction. Something he observed in footage that was publicly broadcast, that thousands of people watched, that reporters and retired detectives and online investigators combed for anything they might have missed. And none of them named it. Not one. Type day 59 inches if you're ready to hear what it was. Now stay to the end, because before I give you the observation itself, you need to understand what Brian Entin's access on that morning made possible, and why it matters that he was still there at all. Day 59 was Tuesday, March 31st, 2026. 7 weeks into the investigation, Brian Entin was still in Tucson, still on the ground, still physically present in a neighborhood that national media had largely departed. That morning, he reached a position he had never reached before in this investigation. The back of Nancy's property. On foot, on the neighboring side of the private boundary line, close enough to see the actual structure of the rear of her house from ground level. He had built relationships with neighbors over the prior weeks that made that access possible. And what that position showed him corrected something he, and most people watching this coverage, had assumed based on aerial footage for weeks. The ground-level view revealed something the drone could not. 3 doors, not sliding glass. He had believed, as the aerial drone footage suggested, that the back of Nancy's house had sliding glass doors. Standing there close enough to read the actual structure, he corrected himself publicly on camera. There are 3 separate doors at the rear of this property, none of them sliding glass. One door sits beneath a covered overhang, fitted with glass panes across the upper portion. The large panel multiple observers had described from drone footage as a sliding door, a fixed window. The second door, fitted with a screen. That screen door is the one Entin was told had been propped open when Annie and Tommaso arrived. And beyond the main house, connected to the property at the far end, the entrance to the casita, the small guest structure that forms part of the complex. 3 distinct rear access points. None of them, according to any public statement from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, showing evidence of forced entry. PCSD has not publicly stated that forced entry occurred anywhere on this property. Not the main house, not the casita. Oh, that absence is worth examining, because it narrows the access question to one of 2 possibilities. Either the perpetrators exploited a vulnerability Nancy herself had left open, or they had already identified and created a point of entry during the reconnaissance that preceded February 1st. The reconnaissance that preceded everything. That reconnaissance appears in the investigative record. January 11th has been established as a date of interest, a point weeks before the abduction when someone may have been at or near this property. Investigators were specifically reviewing camera footage from neighbors across multiple dates in January. And one neighbor told Entin something the coverage has moved past too quickly. Their dog woke at approximately 1 o'clock in the morning on the night Nancy disappeared, looked toward her house, and behaved in a way the neighbor said it never normally does at that hour. It is not forensic evidence, but 1 a.m. aligns with the documented sequence. Doorbell camera disconnecting at 1:47. Motion detection activating at 2:12. Pacemaker app going offline at 2:28. If someone was already moving around that property more than 40 minutes before the first device event triggered, a dog fixed on that direction in the middle of the night is a thread that has not been fully pulled. The terrain. The desert behind the house, seen clearly for the first time from ground level on day 59, makes the question of prior reconnaissance feel less theoretical and more necessary. Beyond the fence line, dense desert scrub, low brush, cactus with thorns on everything, small animal burrows in the dirt, no streetlights, and in Dab's words, at night with a partial or absent moon, absolute darkness. You could walk through it if you had been back there before, if you had mapped it, learned where the footing held and where it did not, memorized where the fence gates were relative to the pool and the doors. If you had not been there before, moving through that terrain at speed in the dark while managing anything or anyone would be extremely difficult. The absence of any reported activity in that desert scrub is itself a data point. It suggests they came and went by routes they already knew. Type the terrain if you're seeing why prior reconnaissance isn't optional. It's structural to how this crime was possible. Now stay to the end, because the man Entin brought with him that morning and what he said about the early drone footage is where this video earns its title. Entin introduced the man he had brought with him that morning, Kurt Dab, retired detective from the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Decades working violent crime investigation in this exact county, not commenting from a television studio on a case he read about, not offering analysis from a distance. The same department, the same jurisdiction, the same terrain. When he talks about how this department processes a crime scene or how a homicide investigation unfolds in Pima County, he is speaking from professional familiarity that is categorical rather than comparative. Dab had never been to the back of Nancy's property before that morning. He stood there, looked at the doors, looked at the brush, And in the course of that conversation, he told Entin something about the early drone footage from this investigation that Entin himself described on camera as something he had never heard anyone say before, something that nobody else had publicly named. Entin asked him directly, "What did you notice when you watched the early drone footage?" Dab placed it specifically in time. Early in the case, his estimate was within the first week, possibly the second. The FBI had returned to the property. The specific visible purpose of that return visit, as he observed in the drone footage, was to remove cameras from the roof of the house, and he believed also from the pool house. The FBI came back and they were taking the cameras off the roof of the house, and I think the other pool house. Those cameras were not original fixtures. Entin had noted earlier in the Day 59 broadcast that they appeared to be new installations, put up after Nancy disappeared, visible in the early drone footage. The FBI's return to take them down suggested they had served whatever monitoring purpose they were placed for. And while that removal was happening, while investigators were working around the exterior of the property, Dab saw the forensic team doing something else, something he recognized immediately from his career. He saw what appeared to him to be perspective shots being taken. Let me show you exactly what that means. Stop right here. If you're still watching, you are about to find out what perspective shots are. Why a career Pima County homicide detective had never seen them deployed outside of a shooting or violent assault. What it means that they were being taken at Nancy Guthrie's property in the first 2 weeks of this investigation, and how they connect to Dab's full reconstruction of what he believes happened inside that house. Most people will click away before the reconstruction section. Before I walk you through exactly how Dab believes this crime was executed, position by position, person by person, from the inside of that house to the blood on the front step. If you're about to leave, don't. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. In a case this carefully managed, the details that surface publicly tend to arrive without warning. Like, share. Because Brian Entin was still standing at the back of that house 8 weeks in, and what he brought back deserves to be heard. Type subscribed. Now let me tell you what perspective shots are. A perspective shot has a precise meaning in law enforcement, and Dab explained it with the specificity of someone who has seen it deployed in practice throughout a career. A perspective shot is not a general photograph of a crime scene. It is not an overhead view, not an establishing wide shot, not a photograph taken from wherever a photographer found a useful angle. A perspective shot is a photograph taken from the exact physical position a specific subject occupied at a specific moment in an incident. At their height, at their angle, along their line of sight. I saw investigators, forensic investigators, taking photographs, and what appeared to me was perspective shots. The photographer stands where the subject stood, and from that exact location, at that exact orientation, they capture what that person would have been able to see, what was in their field of view, what was accessible to their vision, what the geometry of the scene looked like from the position that person occupied during the moment of the event being reconstructed. The purpose is documentary. These photographs become a permanent part of the forensic record. They do not interpret. They do not argue. They document spatial reality from a specific confirmed location, establishing with photographic evidence what was and was not visible from a given point, in a way that can be presented to a grand jury, to a review board, or to a jury in a criminal trial without requiring a witness to describe it. The officer-involved shooting application. The clearest and most common application of this technique, and the one Dab used to explain it, is officer-involved shooting reviews. When a law enforcement officer discharges their weapon, the investigation that follows involves returning to the scene. The officer identifies the exact position they occupied when they fired. A photographer steps behind them and documents the scene as the officer would have seen it from that exact spot. What was directly in front of them? What was to either side within their realistic visual range? Whether the threat they reported was visually accessible from the confirmed position. Those photographs become part of the administrative review, part of any grand jury presentation, part of the civil litigation record, and in cases where criminal charges are brought, part of the trial record. They are not open to argument about whether the photographer interpreted the scene correctly. They document what is physically there from a documented position. The stabbing and assault application. The technique extends into violent assault investigations. When two parties give contradictory accounts of where they were standing during a confrontation, investigators place people at the reported positions and photograph the sightlines. In stabbing cases, questions of approach, of whether a victim had the spatial opportunity to see an assailant coming, of whether the angle of entry into a room is consistent with the account given. Perspective photographs document the geometry of the encounter in a way that physical description alone cannot. The Queens case, what perspective shots can do. There is a documented case in New York, a 1994 shooting in Queens, where crime scene reconstruction through positional analysis, conducted nearly 3 decades after the fact, placed the actual shooter at a location within the building that was irreconcilable with the confessions extracted from 2 men who had been convicted. Those confessions had placed the men at positions that the physical evidence, when properly reconstructed, showed were geometrically impossible, given the confirmed bullet path and the confirmed position of the victim. 2 men who had spent a combined 37 years in prison had their convictions vacated. Oh, not because new witnesses came forward, not because new physical evidence was collected from the scene, because investigators stood in documented positions, with documented sightlines and photographed spatial reality, and that spatial reality contradicted the story that had put those men in prison. The photographs did not lie. The original investigation did. What makes them possible, and why that matters here. Perspective shots cannot be taken from a general area. There is no forensic value in standing somewhere approximate and photographing outward. The physical evidence has to have already placed a specific person in a specific location, with enough precision that standing in that location and documenting the view is a meaningful act. Blood spatter placement, footwear impressions, trajectory analysis from an impact, camera footage with confirmed angles. All of that physical reconstruction has to exist before a photographer can stand in a position and take a shot that belongs in the forensic record. The photograph is the documentation of a position the investigation has already established, not the discovery of a position it is still looking for. Type quote, the photograph documents what the investigation already established. If you understand why that sentence changes what perspective shots at Nancy's property mean, now stay to the end. Because what Dab said when he processed what he was seeing, his word, his exact reaction, is the detail that makes this observation significant. When Dab processed what he was seeing, forensic investigators working in a manner consistent with positional reconstruction, his immediate reaction was one word. Weird. His word. Not mine. No, not in cases that were not officer-involved shootings or violent crime. That is where those things would come into play. He had never seen this technique applied in a case that did not involve a shooting, a violent assault, or a stabbing, and at the time he observed it. This was officially a missing person case. No shooting had been reported, no stabbing, no publicly documented assault scene. A missing person, and a forensic protocol that belongs to violent crime reconstruction. That gap between what the case was officially classified as and what the forensic activity at the scene reflected is the detail that has no public explanation. The 2 alternative explanations Dab offered, he was careful not to overstate his conclusion. He offered 2 alternative explanations for what might have been documented. 1. Height calibration. Perhaps the cameras removed from the roof were being used to establish measurement data about the property's geometry from a height perspective. 2. Entry point sightline analysis. If someone had come over the wall at a particular location on the property, what would they have been seeing when they arrived on the other side? Both are possible. Neither belongs in a standard missing person search. Height calibration from confirmed positions and entry point visual field analysis are the forensic language of crime scene reconstruction, of investigators who have built enough of a theory about how a specific person moved through a specific space that they are committing that theory to the photographic record. In the first week or 2 of this investigation, before the public conversation even understood what it was looking at, the investigators were not running a missing person protocol at that property. They were running a violent crime reconstruction, and they had already developed enough of a physical theory to stand somewhere specific and document it. Type violent crime reconstruction, if you understand what that means for the classification of this case in investigators' minds from the beginning. Now stay to the end, because Dab's full reconstruction of what happened at that house, position by position, person by person, connects directly to where those perspective shots were most likely taken. Are you still with me? Dab's broader reconstruction of what happened at Nancy's house connects directly to the perspective shot observation, because both pieces of information speak to the same underlying structure of what he believes occurred that night. The number of people, His assessment of the number of people involved runs between 2 and 4. The logistics of what appears to have been accomplished, removing an 84-year-old woman from a residential property in the early hours of the morning without triggering neighbor responses, without leaving interior trace, without producing any camera footage of Nancy herself being moved, require coordination that a single individual operating alone cannot provide. The backpack carried to a residential property at 2 in the morning is not a burglar supply. Dabb named it for what he believes it was, on camera. A kidnapping kit, prepared in advance, assembled for a specific purpose related to a specific target. They were either really pros or really lucky. And I think it's a mixture of the two right now. The sequence, his reconstruction runs as follows. Someone was already inside the property when Nancy returned home from dinner on the evening of January 31st Street. That person subdued her inside the house, and that is precisely why the interior showed no visible disruption. A controlled takedown by a prepared individual who knows the layout does not produce the scatter and chaos that an unexpected confrontation generates. Everything in that house stayed where it was, because the person who moved through it had planned exactly how to move through it. All family. Immaculate rooms, because someone knew exactly where everything was before they went in. Then a second person was positioned at the front. Nancy, still ambulatory, was guided toward the front door. And at the threshold, at the front steps, at the moment she could see the street and understand with certainty that this was her last chance. Something changed. She resisted, and the blood came from that moment. The blood pattern, what it tells investigators. Dabb's reading of the blood pattern is specific, and it matters. The drops fell straight down. No lateral trajectory, no travel across the surface of the step or the ground, no smearing consistent with movement while bleeding, no arterial directionality indicating force from a distance. The drops fell straight down, directly beneath where the person was standing. That is the physical signature of a head wound or a nasal injury in an upright, stationary person. Blood falling vertically from the point of impact, pooling directly below, without lateral spread. It is not the pattern of a struggle sustained across a space. It is not a body being dragged. It is a single, contained moment of violence at a fixed point. A person standing at the front door. A strike. Blood falling straight down beneath them. Then movement out of the frame, to a vehicle, into the darkness. Oh. One moment. One location. Straight down. The vehicle. There was no car visible in the driveway, or immediately at the property in any footage reviewed, which means whoever drove Nancy away had a vehicle positioned elsewhere, down the street, around a corner, close enough to move fast once she was outside the fence line, but far enough to stay out of any nearby camera's reach. If there was a waiting vehicle operated by a third participant, the minimum configuration becomes 2 people at or inside the house, and 1 person behind the wheel of a car staged down the street. Dabb described that configuration as the one most consistent with the logistics of what appears to have been accomplished. 3 individuals, working a coordinated extraction. In a residential neighborhood. In the early hours of the morning, with assigned positions, a prepared route, and a vehicle already in place. Where the perspective shots fit. Now place the perspective shots inside that reconstruction. Investigators standing in specific positions at that property, photographing specific sight lines, means they had already identified from physical evidence where someone stood during the violence that produced the blood at that threshold. Whether it was the position of the masked figure documented on the doorbell camera, reconstructed from the confirmed angle, and supported by the blood spatter placement. Whether it was a position mapped to the person Dabb believes was already inside, someone who moved through the interior and guided Nancy toward the front without leaving interior trace. Whether it was an entry point at the back, the screen door and its line of sight toward the interior, with investigators documenting what a person approaching from that direction would have been seeing as they came in. All of them are possible. All of them require that investigators had developed enough of a physical reconstruction to stand somewhere specific. None of them belong to a protocol designed for a missing person search. Type 1 moment 1 location straight down if you're holding the weight of the blood pattern now. Now stay to the end. Because the early investigative failures, and what they cost this reconstruction, is where the accountability dimension connects directly to the forensic picture. The early investigative failures are part of this picture, because they defined the gap between what the scene could have preserved and what was actually documented before it degraded. The insider who spoke to Entin confirmed that the team assigned to the initial response was not composed of experienced homicide detectives. The supervisor overseeing those critical hours had, according to that source, never previously investigated a homicide before being placed in charge of the unit. Former Pima County Sheriff and United States Surgeon General Dr. Richard Carmona appeared on Entin's program and said publicly that Sheriff Nanos made a scene release decision that should have been the lead detective's call. Carmona's characterization was direct. The scene was corrupted by that premature release. Retired FBI agent Steve Moore said that had the Bureau been present from the first hour, investigators would have pulled tiles from the front step for high-velocity blood spatter analysis, a process that recovers positional and directional data embedded in the surface beneath visible pooling, data that cannot be recovered once the surface has been walked on. That analysis did not happen. And yet, the FBI came back within the first week, or possibly the second, as Dabb observed in the footage. They were there. They were removing cameras from the roof. And while they were there, forensic photographers were working the property in a manner consistent with positional reconstruction, standing in specific spots, documenting specific views, at a property where officially no shooting had been reported. No stabbing, no documented assault scene, a missing person, and a forensic protocol that belongs to violent crime reconstruction, GEOFENCING, the tool that leaves a hole. Dabb also raised the investigative tools that have likely been deployed at a scale the public communications have not reflected. Geofencing, placing a theoretical boundary around a geographic area and identifying every cell phone signal active within that perimeter during a specified window. You put up a theoretical fence around this 1 or 2 mile area so you can see what cell phones were being used at that time. The fact that no one has been publicly placed at the scene through that method, if it was applied, either means it was not applied, or it produced results consistent with the cellular jammer theory that has circulated in the community. A jammer can suppress signal activity within a limited radius. If one was active near that property in the early hours of February 1st, geofencing data from that area may have a hole in it that corresponds precisely to the timeline. Dabb raised that as a possibility, not a confirmed fact. But in the context of a crime this well planned, the possibility is not trivial. The silence around the reward, 70 days, a combined reward of over $1 million, and nobody has claimed it. Dabb addressed the silence directly. He raised the possibility that the person who organized this operation understood from the beginning that participants represent the primary risk. Someone capable of planning and executing a crime at this level and sustaining operational security for over 2 months might be capable of deciding that the people who could talk are the people who should no longer be available to do so. He said he has seen that logic play out in homicide cases before. Whether that mechanism is part of what explains the silence here, whether participants are unable to come forward rather than unwilling, is not something anyone outside the investigative file can answer. Unable rather than unwilling. That is the darkest version of why $1 million sits unclaimed. Type unable rather than unwilling if that sentence changed how you see the reward silence. Now let me close. Here's where we are. Day 70. What is now in the public record? Kurt Dabb, retired Pima County homicide detective, observed in early drone footage that FBI investigators were working at Nancy's property in the first week or two in a manner consistent with perspective shots. Positional forensic photography used exclusively in violent crime reconstruction. He had never seen this technique applied in a case that did not involve a shooting, a violent assault, or a stabbing. His word for his reaction when he processed what he was seeing: weird. The case was officially classified as a missing person investigation at the time. What the perspective shots imply. To take a perspective shot, investigators must have already identified from physical evidence where a specific person stood at a specific moment. The photograph documents an established position. It does not search for one. If perspective shots were being taken at Nancy's property in the first 2 weeks, investigators had already built enough of a physical reconstruction to stand somewhere specific and commit it to the forensic record. That reconstruction exists. It is in the investigative file. It is not public. Dabb's reconstruction, someone already inside the property when Nancy returned home. Controlled interior takedown. The reason the rooms were immaculate. A second person at the front. Nancy guided toward the front door while still ambulatory. Resistance at the threshold. Blood falling straight down from a single fixed point. A head wound or nasal injury in an upright stationary person. A vehicle staged down the street. Minimum 3 participants in coordinated positions. What Brian Entin made possible. He was still there on day 59. Still standing at the back of that house in the desert brush. Still building the access and the relationships and the conversations that produced this. That is rare. If his sustained presence in Tucson, 8 weeks in, when nobody else was, has meant something to you, drop a thank you, Brian, in the comments. That kind of work deserves to be said out loud. The open question. What were the perspective shots documenting? The position of the masked figure at the front door? Reconstructed from confirmed camera angle and blood spatter placement? An entry point at the back, the screen door, and the sightline toward the interior? Or something deeper in the property? A position the physical evidence was precise enough to place? Drop your analysis below. This community has consistently been ahead of the official communications. That matters when the official briefings have been this carefully managed. If you have information, FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL FBI, 1-800-225-5324. Online, tips.fbi.gov. Pima County Sheriff, 5203-514-900. Anonymous, 888-CRIME88. $1.1 million plus combined reward. All tips remain anonymous. Type Nancy Guthrie one more time. Day 70. Type your country and city. Type Amen. Pray for the perspective shots to eventually become the public record. Pray for the reconstruction to close the distance between what investigators know and what the courtroom will hear. Subscribe. Because in a case where the official briefings have been this carefully managed, the details that surface publicly arrive without warning. And they changed the picture. Family, I love you. Every single one still watching at 30 minutes, because a career homicide detective said the word weird, and nobody else had named it. The visual record of this reconstruction exists. It is in the investigative file. And whatever it shows, the geometry of a crime committed in the dark of a desert night, is sitting there waiting for the moment it can be presented to a jury. Keep going. Keep going. I'll see you in the next one. God bless. I'm Marcus Webb, and if you're new here, subscribe and join us. Like, share, and be part of the family.